I think our online viewers are probably clicking in about now, and we want to take advantage of having such a distinguished panel to have the full 2 hours before we break for what I know will be a very good lunch. Well, good morning. I'm Richard Schmier. I'm the President and Chairman of the Board of the Middle East Policy Council, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's program. To all of our Muslim friends, on behalf of all of us at the Council and our friends at AGSIW, we certainly wish you a very, on the occasion of Eid, best wishes on the occasion of Eid Mubarak. For this, our 112th Capitol Hill Conference, we have the pleasure of co-hosting with the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, a fellow NGO dedicated, like MEPC, to improving understanding between the U.S. and the region. With today's event, we are pleased to return to Capitol Hill for an in-person session for the first time since 2020. Our thanks to all of you who have joined us here in the Senate Dirksen building, as well as to those who have joined us around the world through the live broadcast. For our discussion today, we have assembled an outstanding panel of speakers to address the timely issue of the future of security in the Middle East. We look forward to a robust discussion of that issue with our panelists. But before I turn to today's program, I would like to say a few words about the Middle East Policy Council. The Council was established in 1981 for the purpose of promoting dialogue and education concerning the U.S. and the countries of the Middle East. 2023 marks our 42nd year of such contributions to the U.S. Middle East dialogue. Among our core programs are our quarterly Capitol Hill conferences, such as today's event, our quarterly journal, Middle East Policy, the newest issue has just come off the presses, which can be found in more than 16,000 libraries worldwide, and our educational outreach program, Teach Mideast, which provides educational resources on the Middle East geared to secondary school students and teachers. We also have several products focused on the informational needs of embassies and Capitol Hill staff. Please visit us on the web at www.mepc.org and our Teach Mideast program at www.teachmideast.org to learn more about our organization and our activities. Concerning today's event, the conference proceedings will be posted in video and transcript form on our website, as will a recap of the program. An edited transcript will be published in the next issue of our journal, Middle East Policy. Now let me turn to today's distinguished panelists. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Doug Silliman, President of our co-sponsor for today's event, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and a former ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait. Ambassador Silliman will be followed by the Honorable Mary Beth Long, a former Assistant Secretary in the Department of Defense. Following Mary Beth, we have Professor David DeRoche, Associate Professor in the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies of the National Defense University. And then our fourth speaker will be Ms. Asha Castleberry-Hernandez, a Security Fellow in the Diversity in National Security Network and a former senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the Department of State. As you have seen, we have placed index cards on each of the seats. As you have questions, please write them on the index card and hold the card up for our staff to collect and bring to the table. Please do so during the panelists' presentations. They will be given to Basima, who will organize the discussion session. For those joining us through the video broadcast, please submit your questions through the email address info@mepc.org. Our discussion today will be moderated by the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council, Ms. Basma Al-Hussein. With that, I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Doug Silliman.
Rich, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm really thrilled as the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington to be here and to co-host this event. We're glad to be back on Capitol Hill after a long absence because of COVID, and we hope that we can do things like this more often to bring the factual basis and the details of the way that the countries of the Gulf work to people on the Hill who would like to know more. I want to thank Rich Smear and Basma Al-Hussein for cooperating with us, and from my staff, Raymond Karam and Bushra Lawrence, who worked very hard to make sure that this all came together well. And since I am the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute, I'm going to focus my remarks mostly on the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula at first, but I need to start with a global overview to give you the context within which the security of the Middle East is going to evolve in the next decade. And I've got a confession to make to start. I'm a Cold War kid. I came of age in the 1970s, and it was clear to me throughout my childhood and adolescence that there were two big countries in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, and that every country in the world leaned to one pole or another. The world was bipolar, and everything was built around that particular paradigm in the world. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the early 1990s, the United States became the world's sole economic, political, social, and military superpower. And it was in this context that I worked for most of my career as a diplomat, where there was American dominance in every factor, every issue, every topic, in every corner of the world. And unfortunately, in American domestic politics, this U.S. dominance is assumed to be continuing, and frankly, it has become politically unquestionable. And that's making it more difficult for Americans and others in the world, but especially policymakers, to understand the changes that the world is going through right now. In recent years, it's become clear that the United States has got two significant near-peer adversaries in the world, in China and Russia. But in addition to that, there has been the rise of a number of regional powers, middle-sized countries who are beginning to make sure that their foreign and defense policies fit their own vision of their country's interests. And among these countries are Turkey, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, and even close American friends and allies like Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The world has become multipolar, and it can no longer be evaluated in zero-sum game terms. It's not one side versus another, but a whole multiplicity. In some ways, this is no longer checkers, but three-dimensional chess. So, to the Gulf. While I am uncomfortable as an ambassador who spent a lot of his time in the Gulf, I have to say that many of our friends and allies in the region have lost confidence in the United States as a reliable security partner. Many believe, frankly, that the United States incorrectly is withdrawing militarily from the region. It's more a sense of an American withdrawal of importance, a pivot to Asia. And there are many reasons that we can talk about later in Q&A why this might be the case. But what is interesting now in the past couple of years in the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf, is that while countries still prepared and are building their capabilities to counter what they see as security threats in their region, they are also conducting de-escalation and diplomacy to try to reduce the chance that those threats will be exercised and that they will have to use the capabilities on the military side that they're developing. The most recent example of this is the Chinese completed Saudi-Iran deal to reestablish diplomatic relations, but this is not the only example. Over the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen de-escalation in tensions between Turkey and the Gulf. We've seen a real move toward Arab reconciliation with Syria. We've seen a significant search for peace and a solution in Yemen. And the Gulf has brought Qatar back into the full fold of the GCC after a 4-year shun from the other countries. So in the context of Gulf relations, I want to look specifically for a couple of minutes at 2 countries that are important here on Capitol Hill, Iran and China. And I'll start with Iran. The focus of U.S. policy for this administration and the previous 2 administrations has been Iranian nuclear weapons. For the Obama administration, it was negotiating the JCPOA. For the Trump administration, it was getting rid of the JCPOA. And for the Biden administration, trying to figure out what to do with the JCPOA. Washington still sees Iranian nuclear weapons or the possibility of nuclear weapons as the biggest threat. Israel obviously sees Iranian nuclear weapons as an existential threat. But what is different is that people in the Gulf view this differently. In my personal view, Iranian nuclear weapons or the weapons program is not Iran's most important asset to project Iranian power in the region, and most of our allies in the Gulf see it the same way. The Gulf is much more concerned about, 1, drones, missiles, cruise missiles, and the ability of Iran to attack their targets with some facility, and 2, Iranian support for proxy forces in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and opposition groups in the Gulf itself. And many in the Gulf have concluded, as I said, that the United States cannot or has chosen not to defend them against these latter 2 threats. Let me turn quickly then to China. Many in the United States see Chinese action, expansion commercially, and to some extent militarily and politically into the Middle East as a direct challenge to American dominance and an attempt to undermine the U.S.-led rules-based international order. Many analysts, Chinese analysts and European analysts that I have spoken to, especially in the light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, see Chinese actions in the same way. Attitudes in the Gulf are different. Even though the Gulf has benefited greatly in the past 5 decades from this U.S.-led system around the world, especially economically, they seek now greater autonomy in decision-making and want to have more independent sovereign choices as nations to do what they believe is best for their country. And frankly, along the way, Asia has become the biggest oil and gas market for the Middle East. They don't sell oil and gas to the United States anymore in great volumes. The unconventional production in Canada and the United States has essentially given us much greater leeway to not buy from the Gulf. China has been willing to sell technology to the Gulf that the U.S. and Europe has not been willing to do. There's longstanding Chinese cooperation with Saudi Arabia on ballistic missiles. And frankly, China is happy to undersell high technology like Huawei 5G equipment to the Gulf at prices and terms much more favorable than American or European providers. And then finally, there's the intangible. There's a sense in the Gulf that maybe the systems of government in the Gulf and the systems of government in some of the countries in Asia are more compatible. The model of Lee Kuan Yew's top-down development of Singapore is much admired in the Middle East. And it's not as messy as they see American and European forms of democracy. So there is a draw of a top-down development model that they see as valid as a messy democratic model that we have here. And Gulf governments are arguing very strongly that they have the right to make sovereign choices based on their own best interests, and they don't have to defend a larger system of governance around the world. And maybe the biggest issue that we have dealt with as an institute, and I think the U.S. government is dealing with now, is that many of the governments in the Gulf see their relations with China and the relations with the United States as in 2 separate baskets. So if you do something with China, it shouldn't affect the United States. If you do something with the United States, it shouldn't affect China. But the reality is that there is a permeable membrane that links these 2 baskets. And some of the things that the Middle East has done with China affects American policy, and vice versa. And this is a logic that the Gulf has not yet realized and has not yet taken action to correct. That said, China at the moment does not appear to be trying to replace the United States as a security provider in the Middle East. Frankly, it can't. China still benefits from the significant investment that the United States has made in maritime security over the past 40 years that protects the trade lanes between the Middle East and the Far East and everything else in the world. And China cannot project sufficient military force to protect those trade routes, even between the Middle East and China. And finally, China seems to be sticking its toe in the diplomatic water. They have tried to begin to mediate, and the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to reestablish diplomatic relations is their first kind of success, although they came in at the very end. The question in my mind, however, is whether or not China is truly invested in helping enforce this agreement. If, for example, Iran or Saudi Arabia does something that upsets the agreement or goes against the terms of the agreement, what will China risk? Will they risk their economic relations with either country? Will they put pressure on either country to take ownership of this agreement for which they're trying to take credit? And I've got 5 things here at the very end of the remarks that I want to recommend to this group and for U.S. policy in terms of my thinking and 3.5 decades as a diplomat. The United States can protect its interests in the Middle East. We just simply need to compete a little bit more for them. We can't take our dominance for granted. And there are a lot of things we might be able to do about it. First of all, reestablish high-level contacts with Gulf leaders in government, in business, in civil society. The Biden administration dropped the ball at the beginning on this, but has done a better job. I'd also like to see on the Hill more CODELs and more staffdels, and frankly, more bipartisan CODELs and staffdels, so that the leaders of the Gulf cannot play the 2 American political parties off one another. Second, we need to work on expanding real on-the-ground security cooperation in the Gulf. I think Dave DeRoche is going to talk a bit about this, but I want to mention one thing, the Digital Ocean Project, which uses subsurface, surface, and aerial drones and artificial intelligence to put a very accurate picture of what's going on in the Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea with the participation of our allies. I'd like to see this expand into air defense to the extent that that is possible, although it's a bit more difficult. Third, and again, really directed at an audience on the Hill, we need to depoliticize our relationship with much of the Middle East. That has to happen by bipartisan agreement on what the core interests of the United States in the Middle East are. And as someone who served in 6 administrations, the flips back and forth between Republican and Democratic presidents has been difficult to explain and difficult for some of our friends and allies to deal with. Fourth, we can begin to better define our relations with our friends and allies. We're working right now on an agreement with the United Arab Emirates that we will probably end up calling the Strategic Framework Agreement, to try to define the parameters of the relationship so each side knows what is expected of them and what to expect of the other side. And finally, we need to work to develop the Abraham Accords, the concept of how we can get Arab countries and Israel to work together more closely, although I will note that the attitudes of Israeli governments and progress or lack of progress on Israeli-Palestinian issues will either speed up or slow down the progress. So I know I've gone over my time, but thank you all very much. I'd like to turn the floor over to the Honorable Mary Beth Long. Mary Beth?
Thank you, Doug. You would think that Doug and I coordinated a lot of our points ahead of time. We happen to think the same. I'm going to perhaps frame them slightly differently and dig down a bit more, but I associate myself particularly with most of his recommendations, although I think 2 of them are problematic, and we'll get to that in just a second. I really think I teach my students that before you listen to a speaker, you ought to really know more about where they're coming from. So let me tell you sort of the context of where I come from. My first job out of life after college was in the Arab world, where I picked up a little bit of Arabic. Absolutely fell in love, although I was a sinologist at the time, and on my way to CIA, where I was a case officer, and spent a lot of time abroad. Then I went to the Department of Defense, ended up overseeing the Middle East, NATO, Southeast Asia, et cetera, but also security cooperation efforts. And actually, David and I worked together there. He was great. He put up with a really grumpy boss occasionally. but so got very much involved in our relationship with the Middle East. And in those days, of course, most of the underpinnings of our relationship with the Middle East were two things: shared values. And we did have shared values. We had big disagreements on what was happening in Iraq and other places, but at the end of the day, there was mutual respect and a real desire on the part of most of the Gulf states in particular to really align their military with ours. And I think that's changing and perhaps has even changed. And thirdly, then I became a business person in the Middle East with businesses in Libya. I still have a business in the UAE, so a lot of my context comes from there. But I'm going to frame most of my comments from my current role as part of a third country group that's been meeting for 3 to 5 years now at a very senior level, but involving Russian representatives who are Middle East experts who work with the government, Chinese, Indian, UK, France, US. We've met with the Arab League on a regular basis. We met multiple times with very senior Iranian leadership. And that group, as you might imagine, has a very different take on where we are in the Middle East. And from that perspective, I'm going to focus most of my comments based on what I get out of that group. 2 big points I want to have you walk away with. And Doug, I think, touched upon them. I'm going to be a little bit more blunt. Probably not in my lifetime have I understood that the United States' ability to shape events in the Middle East have been so low. And frankly, worse than that, I think our ability to even persuade and to get our interlocutors to change their minds is at possibly, at least in the last decades, an all-time low. And that has profound implications. You know, why do we care about the security in the Middle East? Because it has implications for American security at home and our interests abroad. And our inability to shape what's going on there and to even interject in meaningful ways on very important issues, I think puts us in a situation where our security is at risk, and at risk in ways that we had not anticipated, for a lot of the reasons that Doug touched upon. Secondly, I think what we're going to see in the next couple years for the United States, that we're used to viewing ourselves as dominant in that region, is going to appear really chaotic and really difficult to manage. And that, I believe, is based on the decision that has been made by many of our Middle Eastern counterparts, and in particularly the Gulf, to align themselves not just in a multilateral world, but in multi-camps simultaneously. On some respects, we'll have geographic alignments with our allies and partners in which our interests will either coincide or diverge. We'll have economic camps, the outreach of many of the Middle Eastern nations to the BRICS, their alignment with China, their relationships with Russia. Those are very different than geographic based. And then there'll be issue alignments that they will choose that will be sometimes in coincidence of our interests and sometimes opposed. And what it's going to mean is we don't get to be the senior partner anymore. And in some ways we'll be aligned completely with the UAE or Egypt and on accord, but at the same time dealing with places where we really have divergent interests and divergent policies. And that balancing is going to be really tough for us because we're not used to it, number one. And because of the lack of bipartisanship, I think in particular, we're just not adept. And it's going to seem from a US standpoint chaotic, dangerous, mysterious, and difficult, much more difficult than in the past. I think really the signs of this we have missed, and I'm just going to quickly tick through the signs of this decoupling in some important ways, just to sort of tick through them really quickly. In Syria, you saw some cracks develop. And these were cracks that had sort of been glossed over during the Iraq War, et cetera. We all agreed to disagree, but the relationships were quite close. Syria, they became more profound. Then we had the struggle at the beginning of the Ukraine votes in the United Nations, where, boy, we were so disappointed and somewhat shocked that some of our Middle Eastern allies didn't vote immediately in the ways that we thought, and oh wow, what happened here? What do we need to do? And then we have this this relationship, this building and solidification of relationship with China, and the decision, I believe, of, and let's be honest, it's no different than our decision, but the decision of our Middle Eastern allies and partners that they were going to stick aligned with China economically. We are too, by the way, in important ways. But that decision was made, and you see the UAE making it, you see Saudi Arabia making it, you see Egypt and Sudan. As a practical matter, they can't afford not to because of the context of the peer-to-peer conflict where China is not going away. And if anything, there's going to be a reset. It may be a reduction in the power of the United States economically, but the reality that you can't afford not to be aligned and working with China from an economic standpoint. Third, you had the consideration of many of our allies that, well, dip a toe in with China on economically, might as well do so militarily. And consideration given by many of our Gulf allies and our Middle Eastern allies of actually having a Chinese military presence of some form, or an enhanced relationship of a long-standing one like in Saudi Arabia with China that puts our teeth on edge. And then you have the one that people don't want to talk about, and that's the decoupling of the dollar and petroleum sales by Saudi Arabia with profound security implications and long-term implications across the board for the United States that makes us less powerful, makes us less important, and therefore is a diminishment of our powers across the board. And then you have, frankly, the changes in the Middle East themselves. It's not a vacuum over there. And what you have is the real importance now of Saudi Arabia in many important ways that 2 decades ago were maybe inconceivable, but the UAE having basically become in many respects the banking center, certainly among the world's top 5, perhaps even higher than that, and also a place where Russian dollars, oligarchs, etc., those actors who are circumventing, not illegally, circumvention, by the way, is not illegal, sanctions busting is, circumvention isn't, a lot of that happening in the Gulf. Of course, the Gulf had to deal with this because they had a scare for a moment there for a while when the U.S. was seriously considering energy independence. So my 2 takeaways, we are less important and less able to maneuver in the Gulf. And then secondly, basically, the Gulf is going to be chaotic and difficult to us to manage, and that's going to make us less secure. So let me talk for a second about the factors that drove that. First and foremost, I'm not going to go into it because the ambassador did, is the peer-to-peer conflict. But the second, frankly, is practical decision-making of these leaders that they are going to pursue their own interests. And their interests have diverged from ours. And we can go through all of those, but I've touched upon them. But they will continue and will become more divergent. The third is we have not been able to deal with Iran. They have to deal with Iran. Iran's going to be nuclear, and now they need to hedge their bets. And that has actually forced many of our allies to actually deal with Iran sub rosa in economic and infrastructure, and they know that they have to live there. If they can't get the Iranians to like them, at least they're not going to be target number 1. Whereas we take it depends what day of the week where we are with our Iran policy. Sorry, I didn't make that sound political, but it is. The second is our policies have not kept pace with the changes in the Middle East. They view us as a declining power, let's be honest. Our popularity and our image and our interests, I think a lot of Arabs will tell you in a candid moment, is they're not sure that these alignment of ideals and principles and goals and values is as aligned as they thought it was. And that has incredible implications. And I know I have to wrap up, but I do think 3 other things to consider is that each and every one of those countries, unlike in the past, are involved in at least one or multi-proxy conflicts. Some of them to the good and some of them to the bad. And that's not going to change. And it's going to actually, I think, accelerate. And in many cases, they're aligned either with Russia or Wagner or the Iranians or are tolerant of the Iranians. And that means the world is an increasingly difficult and lacking in security place, including in Africa, where people don't want to look at the Middle Eastern interests as well as the Mediterranean. And then finally, we've got failed states. We can all go through them. We've got a persistent presence of AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and some would say the rise of ISIS, and then some reapproachment. To be honest with you, I think the United States needs to get out of the way on Abraham Accords. Those guys are doing fine on their own. Between most of the Middle Eastern countries and Israel, Israel has managed to throw a clink into the machine with some of their outrageous personal and ultra-rightist individuals that is going to unfortunately bring Palestine back up to the center of attention. It had gone into the appropriate context, so that's going to be difficult. So bottom line for most of you out there, less secure, more chaotic and difficult, and we've got to deal with the fact that we are no longer top dog, that these countries are not against us, they're pursuing their own interests, and we need to figure out how to deal with it.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. My remarks do not reflect the views of the NISA Center or any U.S. government agency. I noticed, first off, I'm grateful to Ambassador Schmier and Ambassador Silliman for putting this together and having me. I noticed that they're confirmed by the Senate. Assistant Secretary Long, of course, is also confirmed by the Senate. And by the way, when I heard I was going to be on the panel with you, I drafted remarks for you because old habits die young, or die hard. But having been confirmed by the Senate, they both are recognized by the United States as having the title of honorable. Asha and I have not been confirmed by the Senate, so I represent the beginning of the dishonorable part of the program. And I recognize that my colleagues here today, if I can be so presumptuous, we're going to focus on geopolitical issues, so I decided to focus on technological issues and issues of military security. Military security, particularly military technology, is never static. Rather, it is probably the biggest driver of technological change throughout history and remains at the forefront of innovation. Once a nation commits to a military technology, securing the resources to maintain that technology becomes a major factor in its national security calculus. For example, in the 18th century, the key agent of national security for the various global empires was wood. Battleships required long boards of thick oak for their hulls to repel shot, and tall, straight pines for their masts. England went so far as to designate all pines in the American colonies above a certain height as royal property, and to make access to overseas naval stores a key element of their security plans. Indeed, one of the reasons Napoleon invaded Russia was to deny naval stores to Britain for its ships. The British recognized they had a problem, and in the aftermath of the American Revolution, they planted a number of dedicated naval forests to ensure they had a reliable and uninterruptible source of oak for new ships. Their thrift was admirable, but their foresight was flawed. The first tree from these new forests was ready for harvest in 1914. Well past the age of steam and steel. The purpose of this historical lesson was perhaps to show my erudition, but to show that the pace of tech, that's an inside joke. Assistant Secretary Long fired me twice, so I have to, is to show that the pace of technology, even for the most advanced country of its age, is faster than governments and even individual men can anticipate. While we can make strategic investments and jump on promising technology quickly, we can't foresee the next development and tend to fall in love with our fielded equipment to such an extent we overlook the potential of the new. The battleship became irrelevant with the sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales by the Japanese Navy in 1941. But Billy Mitchell had demonstrated the ability of aircraft to destroy even the most powerful battleships over 15 years earlier. And he demonstrated it to a Navy who, quite frankly, didn't care. We are in a period of rapid technological change. In the last 5 years, we've seen innovative weapons introduced and then superseded at an impressive pace. The Arab Middle East region, as a region with little indigenous defense production, no real defense science base to speak of, and client relationships with outside weapon producers, is increasingly finding itself challenged to react to these changes. I'll speak to 4 of these developments which have particular significance for the Arab states of the Middle East. The first is missile defense, when great isn't good enough. The progress made by the Arab states and by Israel in missile defense is truly impressive. It's one of the triumphs of an otherwise spotty record of U.S. defense capacity building. From having no real capacity, countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE have become among the world leaders in ballistic missile defense. They've done this by buying and properly fielding the best U.S. equipment. The Saudis are the most proficient force in the world in intercepting ballistic missiles. They have over 300 intercepts of relatively advanced missiles, mostly of Iranian origin, since the start of the Yemen war. By contrast, Israel has an indigenous industry which is extremely proficient at intercepting rockets and other low-level threats. The UAE has also had numerous threats in Yemen and remains the only country in the world to have ever fired a THAAD missile and to have intercepted a hostile missile with the advanced U.S. THAAD. However, one of the immutable rules of government is that the reward for good work is more work. The success of ballistic missile defenses, which means using radar to track a missile that's on a parabolic trajectory and then launching another missile to hit it at an anticipated point. The fact that we've been successful in that means that the enemy has adapted and uses something that doesn't go on a parabolic trajectory. So in the 2019 Abqaiq attack, only cruise missiles and drones were used to strike at the heart of the Saudi oil industry. Here's how the enemy adapts to effective ballistic missile defenses. The first adaptation is to try to overwhelm the defenses with salvos of ballistic missiles. This relies on the inherent economic asymmetry of missile defense. Basically, a missile costs tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it costs millions of dollars to intercept that missile. You can create multiples, numbers of hostile threats, and nobody has enough to counter repeated salvo fires from a protected or unattacked launch base. The second adaptation is the development of TAC weapons, which either can't be detected with conventional air defense radar, or which cannot be engaged by defensive missiles or guns because of the speed of their approach. In the former category, we have drones, which generally have too small a radar cross-section for existing and fly too low for existing air defense radar to track and locate. In the latter, we have seen the claimed but not proven a development of hypersonic missiles, which will have both the ability to maneuver, making the radar tracking ineffective, as well as the speed to outrun any current defensive weapons. But I would argue that's claimed, not proven. I'm skeptical on the claims by Russia, China, Iran that they actually have fielded a hypersonic missile. Middle East countries have made a huge investment in ballistic missile defense. The investment will need to be sustained and expanded as it becomes easier and cheaper to make and fire ballistic missiles. Indeed, Iran has already transferred technology to produce indigenous missiles to Hezbollah. The U.S. has been trying for decades to encourage the GCC states to build a combined missile and air defense network, but with only limited effectiveness, as Ambassador Silliman noted. The technology needed to identify, track, and intercept these new missiles, these new weapons, is still in its early days. It remains uncertain if any Earth-based system will be able to defeat a maneuverable hypersonic missile, should one actually be fielded. With drones, the challenge is to acquire a small, non-metallic target flying at low level. New sensors which detect and analyze sound, heat, and other characteristics will need to be developed and fielded alongside traditional ballistic defense radar. As with so many other fields, machine learning will help direct targets and separate them from benign signals. The countries of the Middle East are not developing any of these capabilities. Rather, they will wait for these capabilities to be developed and fielded by their partners, usually us, who will have more advanced defense industries, and then purchase the capabilities once they're proven. This approach is expensive and may be less effective than desired because of my second factor, which is the ever-tightening spiral of countermeasures. Let me go back to a little history. Weapons and the means to counter weapons are developing at a rapidly accelerating pace. In World War I, the first prototype of the P-51 fighter, which was the fighter that could accompany U.S. bombers all the way over Germany and back. The first prototype was ready in October of 1940. By 1943, there were fielded in large numbers, equipped with upgraded Merlin engines, produced by the British because the American engines were not sufficient, and basically tipped the bombing campaign over Germany into the favor of the Allies, where we were able to actually accompany and protect our bombers all the way to Germany and back. You can draw a line from the fielding of that and see the U.S. bomber losses go and then just recover. This was breathtaking speed, 3 years from prototype to large fielding. Now consider the changes we're seeing here at the Ukraine war. At the start of the Ukraine war, the weapon that everybody was talking about was the TB2 Bayraktar drone because of its performance in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war. We haven't heard anything about it since. The Shahed 136, 137 that Iran has provided had about 3 months of news media coverage, 3 months where it was uncountable. Now, we don't hear much about it because the Ukrainians have been shooting down about 90% of the ones that come in there. They've found counters to it. We can expect this cycle to continue at an accelerated pace. A weapon will be fielded, a counter will be developed, the weapons or the tactics which field the weapons will be developed to counter that, and it will be replaced. Weapons are becoming more software dependent, and the updates and counters will move towards the standard of continual counter development that we see with antivirus software, where your computer is continually updating every time you turn it on or even while you're in the middle of it. That's the way it's going to go with weapons. It's going to go to hours, not years. The problem for the Arab Middle East countries is that they generally do not have the capacity to physically modify or develop these advanced weapons. They can develop tactics which minimize the effect of rapid weapon developments, but in general, they will seek to rapidly acquire advanced equipment from their Western partners. The risk is that with this accelerated cycle of measures and countermeasures, by the time they're able to identify, get permission, purchase, acquire, train, and field the weapon will already be out of date. By the time the weapons are fielded, their maximum period of utility may have ended. This will have a particular effect on areas of modern warfare, which are most software dependent: cyber, electronic warfare, encryption, precision targeting, and C3I in general. On that gloomy note, let me turn to a third most uplifting issue, and this is the rapid increase in domain awareness. Civilian sensor capability has advanced logarithmically in the last 10 years. Now you have a car which is continually tracked, which is continually in communications. If you run off the road and your airbags deploy, it sends a notice and calls emergency services. My car tells me if I'm drifting out of a lane and maintains a constant distance from the car in front of me. This level of sensors is being applied militarily. As Ambassador Silliman noted, the U.S. Navy is in the lead of this and has established a fleet of unmanned vessels and aircraft which maintain that. The Army and the Air Force have followed the Navy, I'm sorry to say. The Army has Task Force 39, which focuses on counter-UAS. The Air Force has Task Force 99, and if they don't hire Barbara Feldon as their celebrity spokesmodel for that, I will be very disappointed. But Task Force 99, which looks at UAS, I see we have a younger audience, you don't know what I'm talking about. In the past, the sensors have gotten better but have been limited by human interpretation of data. In some instances, as we saw with the Chinese high-altitude balloons, we collected data on this but honestly didn't know what we were looking for. And so only after we realized that there were high-altitude balloons flying over the United States, we went back over our old data and were able to determine that there had been other patterns. In other instances, we see the data is acquired and collected, but it's misidentified and misinterpreted. And the best example of that was the USS Vincennes shooting down an Iranian civilian airliner, in large part because with 1980 technology, the icon on the screen for the airliner was overlaid with the icon on the screen for an F-14, which was actually idling on an airfield. Sensors have improved greatly over the past 50 years, but the human factor remains problematic. I worked at DHS after the second time Ms. Long fired me, and studies have shown that what we learned at TSA, most humans are useless looking at a screen after 20 minutes. What really makes the innovation possible is the fact that machine learning will lessen the burden on humans to interpret and classify that data. Because this development is driven mostly by commercial sector, and because this machine learning technology is so widespread, it is possible that this machine learning is one area where our Middle East partners will be able to develop and field their indigenous capabilities, as called for in Saudi Vision 2030 and other documents. Now, on a less pleasant note, let me take you to my final point, which I call Dr. Strange Dave, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Start Loving the Bomb. Perhaps the biggest future security concern in the Middle East is the possibility of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. This issue has dominated security discussion of Iran to an extent that more immediate threats like drones and proxy warfare have really been neglected here in the West, although not among our partners in the region. Various senior Iranian officials has openly discussed their pathway to a weapon, and a senior American official said Iran's breakdown period is down to a matter of weeks. There are two problems with Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. The first is that if Iran becomes a nuclear power, it may coerce other people there. It will become paramount, and it impose its will in the region. The second, and probably greater concern, is that if Iran becomes a nuclear power, the other regional states may decide that they have to become a nuclear power as well, and will embark on their own programs. This is, I would argue, a worse outcome because it increases the possibility of accident, it increases the possibility of instability, and it increases the possibility of miscalculation. So the first scenario is like World War II. You have a bad person who needs to be opposed. The second scenario is like World War I, where you have a system of multiple countries pursuing their own interests, which leads to some unforeseen escalation. Much of the West's attention has been focusing on presenting the first outcome, even as Iran has moved closer to developing a nuclear weapon. It's noteworthy that in recent testimony, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff went from describing Iran developing a nuclear weapon to Iran having the ability to field a nuclear weapon, which is a key qualifier in language and is not a capability that Iran has. Iran, for its part, has maintained a strong, ambiguous policy about nuclear weapons development, saying they're not developing a weapon while taking actions which seem calculated to do so. The problem with this Iranian policy is that it seems to encourage our partners to develop their own capability. This is not an outcome to be welcomed. The region is concerned about our reliability, particularly since the Afghan bug out, and the Emiratis in particular were extremely unhappy with the lack of a U.S. response to the Houthi missile attacks on Abu Dhabi. America's partners are doubting America's resolves and may look to their own defenses. So perhaps we should take a few steps towards developing a more credible infrastructure, not weapons, but infrastructure, for American support against a nuclear Iran. I'm talking about things like construction of dual-use conventional support facilities, such as hardened revetments, enhanced security special munition storage facilities, enhanced multimodal terminal movements that would offload ammunition and easily disperse it, which could provide the framework for an enhanced regional deterrence capability should Iran actually go nuclear. If we wait until Iran has a nuclear capability to start construction, then these efforts will be seen as escalatory. There is a paradox here. If you wait until there's something nuclear, you can't actually take a preventative measure because that in itself is seen as escalatory. This was the problem we had with ground-launched cruise missiles in the 1980s, Greenham Common. The idea was that if there was a period of heightened tension, they could be dispersed, but by dispersing them, you heighten tension yourself to a level that probably no political person could ever do this. Allowing key partner countries to build facilities to U.S. standards, which could be used if needed, would be a relatively low-cost and low-risk action, which could both deprive Iran of any potential benefit from being the sole Gulf nuclear power, while at the same time reassuring America's partners that there is little value in undertaking the incredible expense of developing nuclear weapons when the means are at hand in extremis to provide U.S. weapons. This is an unpleasant idea to contemplate, but things which are unpleasant often come to pass and must be dealt with. The best example of that, of course, is male pattern baldness. Our choice is to deal with them in advance with cool heads and time on our side, or to deal with them in the moment when emotions run high. It's very rare that a disruptive military threat can be mitigated by pouring concrete, but that's where we find ourselves. We are at the point where a nuclear Iran, albeit with individual weapons rather than a fielded capacity, is pretty much beyond our ability to prevent. We have to prepare to manage that. We've tried negotiations, we've tried confrontation, both have achieved similar results. The progress of military technology proceeds apace without remorse and without regret. However, that doesn't mean we can neglect old-fashioned but still functional technology. The Ukraine war has proven that masked fires still count for quite a bit. And while precise munitions do have an exciting place in warfare, they have not replaced old-school dumb artillery that a commander from Verdun in 1916 would be capable of employing. If we are to enjoy the blessings of development and trade, the U.S., its partners, and its allies will have to deter bad actors by maintaining a credible defense capability across a spectrum of weapons, and that spectrum is rapidly expanding. And the evolution of new weapons does not mean that we can neglect the old ones. They still retain relevance. So we have to do everything, and we have to do more. Which brings me back to the oaken ships of old. The only combatant from the Napoleonic Wars which is still floating and in active service is the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, which is in the Charleston Navy Yard in Boston. An active ship of the U.S. Navy, it has unique maintenance requirements which have to be projected out years in advance. At the Crane Naval Support Activity in Indiana, landlocked Indiana, which is the third largest naval facility in the world, despite the fact that it's south of Bloomington, there is a special grove where over 150 white oak trees are raised and tended just for this ship. In the modern Middle East, as in Boston Harbor, defense requires foresight, vigilance, and planning. I welcome your most difficult question, but warn you that if they are too difficult, I will cry. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Asha Castleberry-Hernandez.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Enjoyed it. So I agree with Honorable Mary Beth Long that we should definitely share a quick background about each other. And one is that my work definitely is more local in terms of working very closely with our allies and partners. Spent many years working with the Kuwaitis and was inspired by Ambassador Silliman, working with him at the Ministry of Defense, and also worked on counterterrorism work with Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq, and did some cool work in Jordan as well. And then continued my services in the same domain as a political appointee as a senior advisor at the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this wonderful allow me to address everyone about my perspective on the future of Middle East security. So I'm going to really double down on just China in general and, you know, the era of strategic competition. And you'll hear that there's a consensus up here as far as how we believe where we're going in terms of dealing with the role of the PRC moving forward. So the future of Middle East security will be shaped by the era of strategic competition. Strategic competition is defined by which country aspiring to global leadership of community of nations presents most compelling vision of shared prosperity, sustainable partnership, and mutual security. So the United States offers a vision of a global order that is grounded in self-determination, the value of open societies, engaging in free trade, commerce, defending human rights, and in the long run, promoting a more stable and peaceful international environment. Yet our strategic competitors, most notably the PRC, offers an alternative and is actively engaged in trying to reshape the international system. So we see this clearly play out in the Middle East. So according to the latest White House National Security Strategy released in 2022, strategic competition will most likely intensify in the next 10 years or beyond that. So the Middle East will experience this intensity transition into more of a contested security environment. Also, the impacts of strategic competition will vary across the region, and we are already witnessing these outcomes when you compare the outcomes with Israel, Jordan, and UAE, for example. So, also to note that we will continue to witness our near competitors compete on a wide range of areas in the Middle East region because we have been so involved in counterterrorism for 20 plus years in the region. We tend to just focus on more on security. But now in the era of strategic competition, that's going to vary across both hard and soft security. So looking at economics, technology, energy, diplomacy, health, and the military domain. So I'm going to address four areas to take into consideration. One is that Ambassador Silliman mentioned, that the U.S. departing the region and deprioritizing the Middle East. As our allies and partners watch the U.S. military footprint diminish and, of course, looked at the Afghanistan withdrawal, many believe that we are leaving, and we're encouraging, and we have encouraged to fill a vacuum with our near-peer competitors, China and Russia. And our near-peer competitors use this narrative to their political advantage, convincing our allies and partners to believe that the U.S. is leaving the region. And as a result, our partners have been more open and looking to work with our near-peer competitors. So, in response, the U.S. is not necessarily leaving. The strategy here is not necessarily leaving, but we're just shifting our priorities, especially investing more in soft power issues. So, Going along with military security and technology, I'm not going to go too deep into our last speaker, but the PRC's role in military security and technology is critical to understand as we calculate the future of Middle East security. Increasingly, the PRC is expanding on their security interests in the region, but I believe at a gradual pace. The PRC's regional security priorities in East Asia is what is limiting them as far as be able to maximize their efforts in security interests in the region, because they have not met their objectives in East Asia, for example, Taiwan. So, moreover, the expansion of Chinese security presence threatens to erode U.S. traditional partners and compromise sensitive information. If the PRC momentum continues, more of our regional allies and partners, will look to the PRC for involvement in their procurement, joint exercises, intelligence, and security cooperation. The PRC security interest also includes building military installations, also purchasing more ports. So beyond the example of UAE, we may see potential more of our allies and partners interested in building these, what we like to characterize civil military infusion entities. For example, Huawei working very closely with the public sector of the House of the PRC, working very closely to build these installations. So, for example, Huawei plays a critical role in supporting the PRC's security interests and determined to expand its role in the region. Just last February, it was reported in open sources that the Chinese state-owned firms are building up their presence near the Strait of Hormuz, and the PRC's investment in regional ports and infrastructure, especially in Oman and UAE, could provide an entry port for China's naval ships in the Strait. Such ships already travel nearby waters to patrol against private vessels, and this trend is somewhat similar to the establishment of Djibouti military base. Some countries in the region will seek to balance between security cooperation with the United States and also a closer relationship with China. However, there are limitations involved in the balancing act. According to a 2022 report from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, countries that partner with Huawei in their 5G networks purchase advanced Chinese platforms and allow secret Chinese military installations likely present too much risk to the United States weapon systems. Washington should make that point repeatedly to our partners, which we're doing, in the region, looking to deepen their ties to China and encourage them to reverse their decision. Currently, there is no necessary indication that the PRC wants to replace the United States as the preferred security partner choice, but is working to diminish and undermine that partnership. It is vital that the United States continues their leadership in supporting the region, especially in counterterrorism efforts. The U.S. needs to continue to demonstrate commitment to its key partners and allies in Iraq and Syria, as we may see another resurgence of Daesh. I just came back from Iraq, so there's a lot of discussions about that right now. Moving along to health security and competition, which is not really getting too much attention. Considering the area of health diplomacy, early on during the COVID-19 pandemic, the PRC aggressively promoted using Chinese-developed vaccines and offered MENA states what appeared to be very advantageous terms to most of the Middle East. However, the United States has the benefit of trust in its relationships in the region. The United States was scaling up vaccine production from the world and working with domestic and other Western pharmaceutical companies to increase vaccine supplies. The U.S. steps to guarantee that other countries, especially developing countries, receive adequate supplies, and the U.S. committed to invest in local vaccine production, like the Chinese did, and to coordinate more closely with our partners. The Quad vaccine partnership between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia committed to expanding local production for safe and effective doses of COVID-19 vaccines over the past 2 years. Trust both in the United States diplomatic promises and in the quality controls of Western firms has meant that more people throughout the Middle East prefer to receive U.S. and Western production vaccines. So we effectively were able to compete against UAE and China's local vaccine production, which they were trying to expand throughout the region and also going into Europe. Move along with peace negotiations. As we know, the big discussion right now is this huge deal between China, KSA, as well as Iran. The PRC is trying to pursue a balancing act in the region by positioning itself as a neutral peacemaker. It is no surprising that the PRC continues to find its opportunities to play as a peacemaker. We have clearly witnessed signs of this behavior prior to the recent China, Saudi Arabia, Iran peace deal. They have made attempts within the last 2 years to become a peacemaker between Israel and Palestine, but unfortunately they failed at it. And then also the PRC has covertly played a part in normalizing relationships with GCC and Bashar al-Assad's regime, plus has tried to set conditions with normalizing relations with Iran by establishing this 25-year partnership with Tehran. So the prospects of the PRC succeeding as a peace negotiator is still up to debate. China will have to confront strategic challenges that compromise its show of neutrality. As part of its deal, all three parties agreed that non-interference in internal affairs of its states is crucial. And we need to watch closely to see if the PRC can really convince Iran to relinquish its malign activities, including in Yemen, Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. The success of the deal will depend on local realities on the ground. Plus, the United States expanding Chinese involvement will not usurp the U.S.'s role in dominant military power in the region. So moving along to my recommendations, they're very short. In this, the future security and what is so necessary as far as making sure that we're more competitive in the region, what matters as far as looking in the future, and it's definitely doubling down on our strategic predictability, it is very important that deliverables matter when it comes to meeting our security objectives in the Middle East. The U.S. must deliver on critical security deals. We can no longer delay on key security deals to our allies and partners unless it's in our strategic national security interest to do so. If unable to deliver, the United States should work closely with its allies and partners to cover down, mainly Europe. Mr. Betts, I see that you're here, so you understand that point here. Also, continue to leverage competitive efforts by creating and expanding on new alliances such as the Abraham Accords. But also doubling down on new opportunities such as helping to create new partnerships between the GCC and our ASEAN community on how we can meet our security objectives. Also continue to maintain our leadership in U.S. counterterrorism efforts in Iraq and Syria. It is prudent that we continue to show our support and I want to thank Congress for actually supporting that U.S. maintain their military presence in Syria. And last but not least, continue to stop the buildup of PRC military installation/basin, and also effective compete in commercial diplomacy. Thank you. That's all I have.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Basma El-Gussein, and I'm the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. We are so excited to welcome you here today, along with our partners, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. And a huge thank you to our esteemed panelists for what were absolutely fascinating remarks. I know many of you have already submitted questions, but feel free to also continue to write questions and just hold them up, and we'll have a staffer come around and grab it from you as soon as they can. Ian, thank you, over here. First, I will start with several broad questions directed to the panelists, and then I'll go into the audience-led questions. Last month, the People's Republic of China mediated a historic normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and President Xi has agreed to visit Iran in the near future. These events point to a larger trend that suggests China is interested in increasing diplomatic engagements in the Middle East, a realm that has been led by the United States in recent decades. As China looks to expand its influence in the Middle East, what potential threats to American security may arise? And will this change the U.S. identity as a security leader in the region? If so, what challenges and opportunities does this ideological realignment present?
Let me start by talking a little bit about that agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's a relatively limited agreement that simply restarts diplomatic relations that were suspended in 2016 after an Iranian crowd attacked the Saudi embassy and a Saudi consulate in Iran. The discussions to reestablish relations had actually begun several years ago in Iraq and were moderated by Oman in the meantime. And I think that the Chinese basically came in and finished the deal. The context also of Chinese relations in the Middle East is interesting because China has, at least for the past decade, looked at Iran and Saudi Arabia as the twin anchors of Chinese, emphasis or in the Middle East because of the ability to provide hydrocarbons to China for their economy. So this is not, in my mind, an unusual place for China to work on reducing tensions and trying to get them back together. So I don't want to make too much of this. I also believe it will be, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We'll see whether the Chinese have actually embraced this agreement and whether they're actually willing to enforce it when inevitably something goes wrong that calls this into question. In terms of attempting this hurting U.S. interests, we don't have the credibility with Iran to have negotiated this or to have closed it. So it really isn't something the United States should have done. And as long as this reduces tensions in the Gulf, I don't see that this is necessarily against American interest, unless our egos are just hurt because we didn't actually finalize the agreement, in which case, I mean, as a diplomat, my egos got hurt all the time. So it doesn't bother me all that much.
I want to associate myself with the ambassador. I think there's the practicality of the proof being in the pudding, what exactly will come of various initiatives, actually, that the China diplomatic efforts are in the region. I think, and I think as a practical matter, the Middle East, Egypt in particular, has some real economics, some real demography, lack of resources problem for China could very well be helpful. No one else has found the solution. So as a practical matter, it's sort of unrealistic to think that our Middle Eastern colleagues and our Gulf colleagues in particular who happen to be the kings of petroleum aren't going to have a relationship with China. So we need to sort of get over it, deal with it, and frankly, embrace it. There could be times that we have objectives that frankly China would be a better immediate interlocutor, much like the Omanis. But where the line has to be drawn because of the way that we're organized is from a military standpoint. Strategic military bases and military acquisitions of Chinese equipment, not because it displaces Americans, but because it is incompatible with the sensitivity that our Middle Eastern partners demand and deserve, with China's proclivity to steal and duplicate, which puts our security at risk. So there, I think we need to just be honest and frank with one another, and particularly our Gulf partners who, by the way, want, at least until recently, to be America-bound when it came to their military equipment. But a lot has changed on our security cooperation. We're really expensive. We're really late. We're really tough to deal with. You know, we promise and then we don't promise, and then somebody on the Hill gets mad, and now we're three years delayed. And in the meantime, the Chinese, the Russians, the Turks, and the Gulf countries themselves are developing some pretty good stuff. So our competitive advantage is low, our reliability is low, and we need to fix that. We need to be a reliable partner who delivers what they need in a manner that they can use it, and that basically nudges out the other players in the important strategic assets. And we need to be clear, that's a red line.
Yes, David?
Well, I'll just make 2 points. The first point is, all the agreement means is we've gone back to 2016 in terms of, so were Iran-Saudi relationships great before 2016? Ask yourself that question. And my footnote to that is there's been an explosion in people writing on the Middle East, and the threat of the blank page and the triumph of the narrative. There's been this narrative that's resistant to facts and arguments since really Robert Kaplan published Monsoon, that the United States is leaving the Middle East and they're being supplanted. This is just another thing adding on that, and the narrative is resistant to argument, and there's a lot of irresponsible commentators who also are resistant to argument. So I think that much too much has been made of this, and I don't see it as a problem, to be honest. Some would argue that China is like the as Ambassador Silliman said, the hard lifting, the initial confrontation were done by Iraq and done by Oman. I'll just close by saying, sometimes the rooster claims credit for making the sun go up.
Thank you. I'll just add on a couple points. One is, again, I remember being in Saudi Arabia, and one of my counterparts said, one thing we realize is that we don't set expectations when it comes to China and their involvement, right, as this peace negotiator or peace deal maker. So we need to set expectations, and then two is, again, as I mentioned before, China needs to deliver. Whatever's in the agreement, they need to deliver. If they can help convince Iran to relinquish its malign activities, then that will, give them more credibility. We've seen in the past where China has made agreements, but no implementation, and they're about 5-6 years old or older than that. And there's plenty of examples of that in the region. And then last but not least, looking beyond the Middle East, I see that this potential agreement can also sway Saudi, Iran more into a closer relationship with China. So when the crises play out like Taiwan, and when you have a situation that was mentioned before from Honorary Mary Beth, where we need your support to help us say, do not condemn us about Taiwan in the UN, that may tilt them towards saying, we will favor your resolution in the UN. So it definitely shapes diplomacy and political affairs, these type of relationships. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. In an article just published in our world-renowned journal, Middle East Policy, Dr. Colley analyzes China's capacity and willingness to replace the U.S. as a security guarantor in the Gulf. He finds there's no consensus among Chinese analysts about whether to counter American power in the region or to compete and even work together where there are common interests. In addition, he shows that the Chinese military is nowhere near able to replace the American military's presence or capability. Do you see the Chinese as interested in replacing the U.S. military role, or is it more likely that China will continue to engage in commerce and diplomacy, leaving the U.S. to provide the military power? Are the Chinese suggesting a new model of focusing more on economic development and diplomacy than on military power, economic sanctions, and human rights? And how will this increase in competition, if there is one, shift American security partnerships in the Middle East? Will military relationships play a larger role in the future of American engagement?
Yes, sorry, I was writing down my notes. As far as replacement, no, I do not think that PRC is will try to replace a U.S. military base, but I think they will build up one to compete against a U.S. military base, and also utilize that military base to conduct surveillance, also use that a way to expand on their security cooperation interests with our allies and partners within the region. So I think, you'll see a level competition enhance as that military base is established, but not necessarily completely replace it overall. And as far as the basing goes, especially when you look at the situation in UAE, if a successful UAE Chinese military base happens, it's operational, and it's doing a really good job of securing both UAE and PRC interests, that can definitely influence other areas, other hotspots to want to establish their own military base. So that's something to take into account. Thank you.
Yeah, I concur.
Excellent. I just have to remind our speakers to please speak into the microphones for
sorry.
the recording. Thank you.
I concur. Let me point out a paradox in American thinking. We haven't seen it in, it was a few administrations ago. People would describe China as a free rider on America's security regime in the Gulf, that the U.S. Navy provides the security for China's trade and imports of oil. That was an unfortunate choice of words, because free rider normally refers to like an ally that, like the NATO allies who don't contribute to their own defense. But there was a paradox in American thinking. If you're saying, well, China benefits from this, okay, what if China decides to step up and sends an aircraft carrier to the Gulf to protect their shipping? We would have a heart attack. So I think the Chinese are smarter. They know that we're kind of in a paradoxical bind. They can capitalize off of that, and they will keep their presence sub rosa, both to bolster their image as sort of the leader of the global South, the leader of the anti-imperialist, the people opposing what they argue is an oppressive world order that the United States input, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, they'll have enough capability there to continue to track, acquire, and if need be, intervene at a time and place of their own choosing. Basically, they get the benefits without the obligations.
I went to school in Taiwan and lived in China for a while in the 80s, and actually started out life as a Chinese expert. I think people underestimate China and President Xi. Even in the 80s, you'd walk down the street in China and everybody, oh my gosh, Dallas, the bold and the beautiful, where is JR? Who shot him? It was amazing, the respect and admiration of U.S. culture. But the same Chinese interlocutors will tell you, oh, we so admire and enjoy American culture, and we cannot wait until we regain our rightful place as an empire, and we can be best of friends. The return and the desire to return, and Xi has been very clear, the return of the Middle Kingdom, the Middle Empire, is something that he seeks. And is something that China, I think Kissinger said it best, China believes it has contributed millennia of contributions in the world. And frankly, their rightful place is to return as the empire of the Middle Kingdom. That doesn't mean we're not involved. We tend to see this zero gain type relationship, but China will rise, and that will mean, as a matter of just mechanics, that the U.S. will become more influential, or less influential, and we need to be able to deal with that. So, is China right now trying to replace the U.S. in the Middle East? Not yet. Maybe it won't. But what China is doing is they're rising and they're flexing. And the great thing about a power that flexes, you can't miss an opportunity to poke in the eye. And they're poking. And we respond. And we need to figure out how to respond to the tactical pokes versus the strategic pokes. And right now we tend to be reflexive. Oh, it's China, it's not us anymore. Frankly, I think the Middle East is made a decision. They're going to find their own defensive strategic posture. And that will basically rely on the West and the U.S., but it's going to be flexible. One of the things they hate is about we always threaten to turn things off when it doesn't suit us. Well, China will not do that, or they'll promise they won't do it. Again, I'm very skeptical that China will be able to deliver on much of anything when it comes to security guarantees, whatever. But these guys, our Middle Eastern allies, are going to do what's best for them. And right now, it's keep everybody sort of at an even keel, and frankly, leverage that to pressure the United States to get their collective selves together on being a better and more reliable and more predictable security partner. And in the meantime, if they can balance China by giving them more, giving it cheaper, giving it faster, and it works for them, they'll continue down that path. But I'm not sure what China's eye on the prize is much closer to home. I don't think they'll risk the Taiwan solidifying what's going on in Hong Kong and basically dominating the Pacific for anything that they're doing in the Middle East. Right now, it's like cost gain ratio, and right now the costs have been low and the gains have been significant in the Middle East.
I was going to make the last point that Mary Beth just made, so I'll leave this one off, not saying anything.
Excellent, thank you. Recently, the Department of Defense released a statement identifying an alignment of threat perception between the U.S. and countries of the GCC, which includes the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait. This alignment is centered around a shared perception of Iranian threats. One, how can the U.S. expand security cooperation with GCC countries in order to better contain Iranian threats? And two, will the Saudi-Iran deal create a wedge between some of the GCC countries and the United States?
A fairly simple answer that I tried to get in my remarks. I think that the GCC states are going to continue to try to develop capabilities to counter Iranian threats, but they will also at the same time conduct de-escalation and diplomacy to make the threats less than they are now or were in the past. So I think you'll see both things happening. The extent to, I think the United States will be very involved in that first piece. I think we should be involved in that second piece, but up to this point, we really haven't been as much as I would like to see us.
Well, turnabout is fair play. I'm going to affiliate myself with the ambassador's comment, with one small exception, the nuclear. And I think David or my other colleagues have touched upon, the nuclear weapons make it a whole different calculus, the proliferation of weapons and the proclivity of Iran to basically the enemy of my friend is my enemy, and the you know what I'm trying to say, not very well. But, who would have imagined ISIS and Al-Qaeda would be in Iran? And it's not far for me to see Iran, which loves to be the spoiler, giving a nuclear or a dirty bomb or some nuclear type capability to a third party, and there's where the hard line is.
Sebastian, if I can talk a little bit about nuclear weapons, because
Sure.
I'm still not convinced that the Iranian leadership has decided that having an actual nuclear weapon is in their strategic benefit. I can see a situation where having a bomb in the basement, the component parts prepared, without actually assembling a bomb and without actually testing an explosive device, gives them some strategic advantage without the risks that it would be involved if they go to building or testing a nuclear weapon. So, as I said in my remarks, I think, frankly, that these low-altitude or inexpensive ballistic missiles and support for proxies is the way that Iran has chosen to project its power in the region. It's less expensive. It is less politically difficult than a nuclear weapon. And I'm not convinced that Iran necessarily has to go to a bomb. They just want the option, and the uncertainty may be more valuable to them than the fact of having a weapon.
So a question on that note for all of you. In light of the recent Iranian-Saudi Arabian agreement, do you see potentially any of these proxy conflicts decreasing throughout the region? And if so, how would that affect stability and American partnerships?
Okay, the answer is, since the reduction in the proxy conflicts is part of the agreement that was discussed, in Iraq, in Oman, and with the Chinese, that will probably happen for a short period of time. But Iranian proxies are no longer as dependent upon Iranian leadership, Iranian training, and Iranian financing as in the past. So my worry is that a more independent PMF unit in Iraq or the Houthis in Yemen will do something without necessarily checking with Iran first and spoil that agreement. So I think there's a real risk there. So I'm hoping that this part of the agreement works out for everybody in the region. I'm afraid it's going to run into problems at some point from one of these Iranian-supported groups.
I had the joy of leading NATO's nuclear committee for a while, so for me, nuclear looms large. I agree with the ambassador with one nuance, and that is having it in the basement and ready to go forces the Saudis to think hard about, there's a Persian bomb, and it will be considered a Persian bomb. I need a Sunni counterpart, or at least the ability to counteract. And then you do end up with proliferation, number one. Number two, having that in the basement ready to go at any moment, who cares whether you're going to test it or not? We think of that because we do things in sequence. I'm not sure the Iranians will be like, hey, the test will be when I use it the first time. Frankly, I'm not sure they're going to go through the regular processes, but that gives you tremendous power. And it's that power that allowed Iran to become proxy players and a basic spoiler, not just in the Middle East, but also arguably in significant places in Africa where we see proxies in Somalia, we see what's happening in Yemen, we see it in Libya, we see interesting dances even in Sudan. I think the proxy conflicts are going to proliferate exponentially for a lot of reasons, not just because of Iran.
Excellent. So I just want to clarify to the audience, many of you submitted questions around the same topics, so I probably will not be reading everyone's note card word for word, but I'll group them around the themes that you all submitted. I do appreciate all of you submitting your questions. Several of you asked about the current state of U.S.-Israeli relations and what the potential future of the Abraham Accords look like. So in that sense, in recent months, Prime Minister Netanyahu's far-right government has faced backlash from Israeli citizens over its plan to restrict the authority of the Supreme Court. Hundreds of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets for over 2 months in what has been described as an Israeli spring. In what ways do the panelists see the domestic turmoil in Israel affecting the U.S. security partnership? And if Netanyahu's government takes more steps towards limiting democracy in Israel, will this change the level of military support the U.S. provides? And finally, how do you think this will affect the future of the Abraham Accords?
I think the Abraham Accords were well launched. The relationship between the UAE and Israel had gotten about as far as it could have gotten before the Accords without coming into the light of day. So I think that that part of the relationship is actually going to be strong. It will probably grow or contract slightly depending upon other political factors, who's in the Israeli government, what's happening on the Israel-Palestine file, are there other Middle Eastern issues that might go forward. I think right now it's going to be very difficult to get another country, particularly Saudi Arabia, which is the one that the Israelis really want, to sign on, given the politics of this Israeli government. And I'm not anticipating that the Abraham Accords themselves will expand quickly. However, there is real opportunity for expanded economic activity, expanded security cooperation, expanding existing intelligence cooperation among GCC states and other states in the Middle East and Israel without anything going on in the Abraham Accords and a formal agreement to recognize Israel. So I see slow expansion of the Abraham Accords, but probably quicker proliferation of ties to Israel on these other areas.
Do you have thoughts, Mary Beth, or you
No,
agree?
I totally agree.
Asha?
I agree. I'll just kind of focus a little bit more domestically, where you are seeing that among our policymakers, elected officials, there's a growing divergence on how we view U.S.-Israel security partnership. And evidently, the most obvious is Senator Sanders and Congressman Bowman, who've been very vocal on we need to relook at the partnership, the security partnership with Israel based on the recent events. Another point I want to add on to is exactly what Ambassador Silliman said. I think that the Abraham Accords will slow down as far as the expansion of it due to the domestic turmoil that's occurring right now. Thank you.
Let me make a general point. Whenever the United States is involved with a security partner or an ally and there's great costs, usually the costs are measured in blood, at some point, if this drags on, there happens to be an informal referendum in the United States on the virtue of that partner. So the bug out in Afghanistan, everybody decided, yeah, these guys are never going to get there. You know, we're just subsidizing villas in Dubai. Withdraw. Same thing with the South Vietnam Republic. You know, if you read the contemporary press in the 70s, you know, you see this drumbeat of articles about corruption and Nguyen Cao Kai and where his wife is, stuff like that. Israel, we haven't been involved from a blood standpoint. We've been involved from a treasure standpoint, but we viewed that as a worthwhile activity, particularly in the context of the Cold War. What I'm reading now is a lot different. It's different because there's internal divisions within Israeli society. So this is no longer the Cold War Arabs against, Soviet proxies. That I don't know how significant that will be, but it is a significant point. The second point I'll make on this is the Abraham Accords. Everybody who has joined the Abraham Accords thought they were getting something or got something. Moroccan recognition of sovereignty over the former Western Sahara, for example. I would argue that the current instability in the Israeli government, if the Saudis are indeed contemplating this, and we have to be honest, we're only guessing, but if they are contemplating it, the price of what they're going to get has risen significantly. And the more instability there is in Israel and the more unpalatable the complexion of the Israeli government becomes, the greater that price will be.
Just to return 1 second to the China as a security guarantor through which this conversation has evolved. When I speak with my Middle Eastern friends, I do tend to try to bring them back to what I think is reality. And that reality is, can you imagine China coming to your defense and deploying troops on your border to keep the Iraqis out of Kuwait? Can you imagine China putting people in your country who will defend you against your foe, whoever it is? I mean, we looked at the Belt and Road Initiative maybe as an example of how China performs, and I think there's a lot of recipients of that who would make a different decision. So at the end of the day, as messed up as all this is and as bad as it's going to get, it really is only the United States that put its most valued treasure, its men and women in uniform, and its diplomats and its USAID on the front lines for our Middle Eastern allies in a number of circumstances. And I don't think that it's conceivable, at least in my world, that you're ever going to see China do that. So choose your friends wisely at the end of the day, because it's a long life out there. And speaking of long life, I have been wrong twice in my life, only twice. And unfortunately, Dave was there both times.
Excellent. And so that actually brings me to a question so Ambassador Silliman, during your remarks, you stressed that China cannot project power in the region the way the U.S. can, but it still has considerable influence, for example, through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. Should the U.S. adopt a more Chinese-style approach that emphasizes economic development instead of military power, arms sales, and economic sanctions?
I don't think that the Belt and Road Initiative or Chinese economic development or military deployments are these unstoppable juggernauts. If you look at their military base in Djibouti, which is, I guess, their largest military facility outside of Asia, they essentially pushed Dubai Ports World out of this port and upset the Emiratis in so doing. If you look at the development in Oman of Duqm Port, which was a major initiative to get the Belt and Road Initiative into the Middle East, the Omanis became unhappy because the Chinese, frankly, didn't abide by the promises they made in terms of investment and local employment. They imported many, many Han Chinese to work in the factories to do construction, and the Omanis significantly scaled back Chinese involvement in that project because of the performance. So the mere fact that there is a Belt and Road Initiative or a Chinese military presence, if not a base, doesn't mean that the Chinese are gaining control or even are winning winning hearts and minds in those areas. So I think that's a more complicated equation than a lot of people think about. The same way that the deployment of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain has got advantages and disadvantages with the Bahraini government and the Bahraini population. That maybe doesn't really answer the question, but I want people to actually drill down, look at what Chinese investment has done in Africa, what the Belt and Road Initiative has accomplished, and frankly for the Gulf, and not so much for Egypt and poorer countries in the Middle East, but for the hydrocarbon-rich Gulf states, they don't need the Belt and Road Initiative. They've got the money that they need. They don't need loans from China. They need Chinese technology. They may want a continued Chinese partner as an export partner for their oil and gas. But you look also, if you're looking at poor sub-Saharan Africa or Oman or Syria or potentially Iraq, you may see Belt and Road initiatives that can have an impact. But I think that for many of the key countries that we've been talking about here in the Gulf, Chinese money and Chinese development projects are far less important. The Chinese want to sell stuff there, much the way that we do. So the relationship is a more even economic, competitive relationship.
Once again, I agree with the ambassador, and I'll even go further. You know, I've been to Duke-Port many, many times and have stood there and looked at the Chinese facility that they stopped doing anything with, and listened to the Omanis saying, you know, this was our anchor. This was supposed to be, you know, the transshipment point for the Chinese, and they've let us down in a number of ways. And I go to Libya. Haven't been there in about a year, but I go fairly frequently. And there was a time right after Benghazi when the planes were full. Everybody moving through Tunisia because you really couldn't fly into Libya, but full of Chinese. And Libya, you know, both sides, both Tripoli and Benghazi, were very excited because China was bringing investment and they were bringing infrastructure and repairs. And let me tell you right now, is like the experience that many of the African countries have. Great deal, sounds terrific, but when it plays out, I end up with fewer jobs, an incomplete infrastructure that's sort of crappily done, hastily done, a loan that I can't possibly pay off, and now I've got infrastructure problems because I now don't even own what I thought I was buying whenever I got into the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I think what the ambassador says, it really does boil down to, if you were most of the Middle East countries, you're actually almost looking at the U.S. and China similarly when it comes to, I need your economics, I need your technology, I need your diplomacy, but the rest of it, I'm becoming increasingly independent in that I'm sort of doing a mix and match. And I think that's where this is going to go. And because we're such a mess from our foreign policy perspective, we're in transition. And we're in transition, frankly, domestically. And that has resulted in us looking just difficult, messy, unreliable, can't speak with one voice. So while we're sort of figuring out, we're going through transition, countries do, internally and externally. While we're doing that, I think what's going to happen is China's going to poke and find it harder to do this than it thought, and it's going to fail a couple times, and it's harder to project the power than it contemplated, and all of this is just going to have to sort it out. But to get back to the topic of the day, that means problems and security issues can rise very quickly and become, and hopefully not existential, we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Excellent. So another question for the panelists is, as you all know, in recent news, we have seen discussion both publicly and privately of a renormalization of relations between the Gulf and other Middle Eastern countries with Assad and the Syrian regime. One, how likely do you see that as potentially happening? And if so, how would that affect U.S. influence in the region?
Thank you. As far as renormalization relationship with the Assad regime, I think the likelihood is most likely going to head in that direction. We already see that among our the GCC states and other partners and allies within the region. They're open door with it right now. And then going back to my original argument with regards to the role of our near-peer competitors, of course, Russia, supports that effort, as well as the PRC, who initially was covert about it, now more overt about it. So I think that you'll see where there'll be multiple countries within the region and our near-peer competitors that are going to support this normalization with Bashar al-Assad. Thank you.
I concur. Let me drill down a little bit. I don't think anybody in the Gulf or in the broader Middle East particularly likes the Assad regime or the Bashar regime. I think they're recognizing that the attempts to overthrow him has failed, and that when I first came into government in the Clinton administration, I worked narcotics, and our big fear was that there'd be a narco state, and we thought that that would be someplace in Latin America, Central America, really. Well, it turns out it's Syria. And, the amount of Captagon produced in Syria is more than the rest of the Syrian GDP. And it's controlled by Bashar al-Assad's brother. So I think that the Gulf states have said, all right, we're not going to get rid of these guys. They're not going anywhere. We've got to do something about it. If we can engage on at least some level, maybe we can moderate some of these bad things, because the primary the primary consumption market for Captagon is the states of the Gulf. The second thing I'd point out here is, I think the comprehensive failure of U.S. policy in Syria to eliminate the Assad rule. I think we need to have an honest question about the regime we've developed to try to project power through proxy stuff. We've established a system where we had so many requirements for people that we wanted to arm as the opposition, that literally the only people who were suitable were expatriate law students, people who lived in Switzerland for 50 years. And we managed to maintain a level of ideological purity that was inversely proportional to military efficacy. And so I think we need to have a discussion of that. And, there are arguments to be made for both. I would point out that if you don't have military efficacy, you're not going to have much opportunity to display your ideological purity. But certainly we don't want to see things, the person we supported in Kosovo is, who was, Madeleine Albright's best friend is under trial at The Hague right now. So, we got to take a look at that as well. That's an honest discussion that we have not had in the U.S. government, and I think it's time for it.
One of the arguments that I hear from the Gulf, and a decade ago, one of the arguments I hear from the Gulf and heard in Turkey a decade or more ago is that it's important for the countries bordering on Syria to try and pull Syria away from Iranian influence to the extent possible. That is some of the motivation, certainly in the Emirates, and I think also in Saudi Arabia, to try to bring Bashar al-Assad in Syria back into the Arab fold and more amenable to convincing to change policies by other Arab countries. Turkey's efforts to do this more than a decade ago kind of ended disastrously for both Turkey and for Syria. So that may be some of the motivation. Right now, Syria is too dependent upon Iran and on Russia for the security of the Assad administration, and I think that the countries of the Gulf, at least, are going to want to try and change that and replace Saudi, Emirati, GCC sponsorship and support for Iranian and Russian support. I note that the position of the Biden administration is that we will not oppose this issue, but good luck. We hope you're successful. So again, that's kind of where I said, I don't see that we can really oppose it, if we have any reason to do so, but their success in making Syria a more stable and less pro-Iran or pro-Russia place is going to be very, very hard.
Totally agree. And I think we have to admit to ourselves that our ability to shape or influence in Syria is pretty much nil. And for us, the real question with Syria is, what about the Syrian Kurds and the Turkish Kurds, the SDF? And the big issue is Turkey when it comes to, I think, where this is all going, at least from the United States standpoint. So I associate myself, but it's perilous for us because I think the proclivities that let it back and let the Gulf sort of sort it, but we are going to have to figure out, do we once again abandon the Kurds? Which Kurds? After we abandoned the Afghans and we abandoned this and we abandoned that. And what is the nature of our relationship with Turkey as Turkey reconciles in some respects to some of the Middle East, but is charting its own path in important ways?
Excellent. As a follow-up, on April 15th, we saw 9 Arab states meet in Riyadh to discuss the potential normalization with Syria. However, we've seen 5 regional countries, Qatar, Kuwait, Morocco, Yemen, and Egypt, push back against the warming of ties with Syria. Will these differences in policy towards Syria enhance regional tension? And if so, how should the U.S. navigate that climate from a security and alliance perspective?
I'll jump first to give you an opportunity to think, because then I'll just associate myself with your more thoughtful response. I actually think it's been remarkable how little the ongoing conflict in Syria has been the center of attention or even dialogue with most of the Middle East, with the exception of Iran's role, the drugs, and the rise of ISIS or the resurgence of ISIS. I think that will pretty much stay the same. I don't see it as a game changer. Where I do think its weight outweighs the fact that it's the Assad regime and the desire for the Syrian people's independence is while it's sorting itself out, Iran is playing an increased role with Russian acquiescence, particularly as our relationship with Russia has deteriorated. It's not really public, but the attacks upon our personnel and our area of interest have exponentially increased in the last couple of years. No one wants to talk about it. That Iranian presence and who basically gets to be the primary influencer of the Syrian military after the fact. Is it going to be Iran or is it going to be Russia? It used to drive a wedge there. Well, now they've found bigger reasons to hold hands, but and that can be both dangerous and hopefully a place of vulnerability. But sucking in to the whole thing, Israel, that has to defend its borders, and using that difficulty to exponentially leverage it to more regional difficulties with Israel. And then again, Turkey, those are the parts. I think, unfortunately, a lot of countries just aren't all that hopeful that there's going to be any changes really in domestic Syria, and the best they can do is maybe get Assad to do one thing versus another, and the horrific displacement of people internally and the refugees hopefully will be able to be the first thing on the agenda to be addressed.
Going back to the original question, I think that the concerns of some Arab countries about reconciliation with Syria will slow down but not end Syria's reintegration into the Arab League, but it may be some time before that happens. What I'm actually worried about is what Mary Beth just said about the interplay between Iran and Russia, and now the greater cooperation by necessity between the two. One of the things that I worked on in Iraq that was very difficult, and especially now in the wake of the horrible earthquakes in Syria and Turkey 6 weeks ago, is getting humanitarian assistance into Syria. The Assad regime has made it absolutely a requirement that the assistance, even UN assistance, go through the regime, be distributed by the regime, and give them control. The Russians in the Security Council have made sure that the access points for humanitarian assistance into Syria are as limited geographically and in terms of what can be sent in. So I think we've got a larger issue. In fact, I'm going to open the bigger question. We've talked about security. The Middle East, in many ways, has got a lot of broader security issues: human security, food security, energy security, water security, that are going to increasingly play a role in the security mix as we go forward. I think Syria is going to be, is the current poster child for the need to think about human security with military security. Yemen hopefully will soon fall into that basket as well, as we try to figure out how to go from a full-blown civil war into some sort of reconciliation. But I'm most concerned in Syria about the inability of the international community, including the United States, to help Syrians. And I think that the return of Syria to the Arab League and to good relations with the Gulf, I hope this will be taken into account, and that's one of the things that I think the current administration is trying to do with our Gulf friends, is to make sure that humanitarian issues are covered in this dialogue with Syria.
Any thoughts over here?
So a couple points. First point is, I don't think the United States has a Syrian strategy, and I think this is a bipartisan issue, and I think it goes across 3 administrations now. What we have are a series of bad outcomes that we're trying to prevent, but we are there to prevent bad things happening. That's not the same thing as a strategy. So we have a presence, the garrison at Tanf, which is there to prevent instability going over to Jordan. That's the forces that have been attacked by the Iranian proxies recently. Then we have support for a Kurdish group that defeated ISIS, that was really the only ground forces, but that our only ally in the region, Turkey views as a terrorist movement, and that we've had senior officials who resigned in protest when we restricted that enclave. And I would love to ask some of these senior officials, what are the exact borders of the Kurdish entity that it is the American moral commitment to? Is every inch of ground that a member of the SDF occupies, is that something that the United States has a sacred commitment to that justifies a resignation in protest if we withdraw from it? Because I don't think we've had that discussion as a U.S. government. And then we have, of course, the fear that there will be basically a railroad going from the Iranian border to Beirut. So we're preventing that. I think the Syrians, on the other hand, are perfectly happy to have ghettoized their opposition in a manner that they can speak to with some degree of authority. That there's so much Islamist opposition in this Idlib pocket that they can basically say everybody who opposes us is Al Qaeda or ISIS. They're happy to control le Syrie utile from Aleppo basically down to Damascus. Everything to the west of that is fine, and it actually serves their purposes to have instability in the east, because that provides the continued justification. And people forget, but when the when the ISIS campaign started, there were actually joint conversations between the United States and Russia. Elise Slotkin, who before she came into Congress was a senior Department of Defense official. They thought they were having a casual conversation on a video link, and the Russians recorded that, put that on TV, and said, you see, this is the revival of the Great Patriotic Alliance against terrorism. That's how the Russians and the Syrians still proclaim their role there. So they have a strategy that they're pursuing ruthlessly. We have a vestigial presence on the ground to prevent bad things happening. And that's a fundamental strategic disadvantage. And unfortunately, it's kind of like the Chinese finger thing, where, the more you pull out, the harder the little finger trap you get. The more you pull out, the harder it grabs you. And it's a bipartisan problem, and it's spanned 3 administrations so far. It's a truly wicked problem that I don't think the United States has a good solution for.
Thank you. Another gaggle of audience questions had to do with human rights violations, particularly in China against the Muslim population. Could you all speak to the fact that Middle Eastern countries fail to really acknowledge this? And is there an opportunity for the U.S. to shine more of a light on that, and therefore maybe make some more headway as an influencer in the Middle East?
Yes. Interesting, a military officer and talking about human rights today. No, thank you. That's a wonderful question. As far as the issue involving Chinese Muslims, Uyghur community, it has been definitely a contentious topic, and of course you just highlighted really well, Basma, that there's been like a lack of movement on getting our Middle Eastern allies and partners to condemn China for what's going on. And I will tell you there's 2 things why that's happening. And one is the fact that, again, because China has expanded its influences significantly in the region, that is what's making them tilt towards of not necessarily condemning them and just being more absent about it, or covertly talking to the PRC saying, hey, this is not right, you may want to address this issue. There's also some misinformation going on here in terms of what exactly what is the PRC up to involving the Uyghurs. where, you have the United States say, this is what's happening in Western China involving the community versus the PRC is actively engaged in saying, no, this is what's happening. So there's misinformation too. And then we're going to see, again, more and more local Uyghurs within the region just out of nowhere arrested, mistreated, facing a lot of issues locally. And then you'll see this issue between the United States and the PRC on how to react to these type of situations. And this will continue. So we definitely need to work more on how to address this issue. And one way to do is actually, right now at the State Department, we have a U.S. ambassador who works very closely on religious freedom. Is he ambassador? Yeah. But he works on religious freedom and works very closely with our partners in the region on this issue. And I think in some way he's making some progress. Thank you.
Can I pile in on that?
Sure.
This is an assertion. The greatest disaster of American foreign policy in my lifetime has been the disestablishment of U.S. information services. That was a self-inflicted, not just a foot shot, but a foot shot with a magazine change. I do a lot of Arabic television, and I know what you're thinking. It's just because I'm so pretty. And I speak to a lot of Arabic, Arab, primarily military and diplomatic academies. And when I raise this issue, what I find is, quite frankly, they don't believe us. They flat out don't believe it. And that is just mind-boggling to this. And I'm not sure whether it reflects Chinese influence and Chinese credibility or the lack of American credibility. But I've had people flat out say, no, we just don't think that's true. And, I can speculate, but I can't explain why. What is really telling to me, though, is that people who should know better, not Arab countries, but the Pakistanis. And I think that, this is a country that claims, Islam is its whole identity as a nation. They are adjacent to that. They are seeing the refugees coming. They are seeing the things going over there. And yet, either the message is not getting out or they are so vested in the relationship with China as a counterbalance to what they see as a repressive, rules-based liberal world order that is always tilted against them and led to the CIA siphoning the gas tank that L.A. Jinnah died in. So that he died on his way to the hospital. The whole paranoid narrative. The United States has done a horrible, and the world order in general, all the like-minded partners that advance human rights. We've done a horrible job. And I can't explain why this issue has so little resonance. I despair.
So on that happy note, I would like to thank all of our panelists and our audience. I do want to just acknowledge that several of you had specific questions directed to specific panelists, and we do have a lunch now, and so I would invite you to please feel free to approach them and speak with them directly on those notes that I wasn't able to get to during the moderated discussion. So lovely to see you all. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.